It was late evening when Jake pulled his truck into the driveway. The sky painted in deep shades of orange and fading blue, the last light of the sun stretching across the quiet street like a warning. He had been gone for 2 weeks on work, expecting to return to the peaceful silence of his home. But the moment he turned off the engine, he noticed something wrong. 3 HOA officers were standing at the edge of his yard, their boots pressed against the line where his land met the street. Their arms were folded tightly across their chests, their faces were stone cold, and their eyes never left him. This wasn't a friendly visit. This wasn't just a neighborly complaint. This felt like something else entirely. Jake opened his door slowly and stepped out, the gravel crunching under his boots. He could feel the weight of their stare. The lead officer, a tall man with a sharp jaw and gray hair, took 1 step forward and raised a clipboard like it was a weapon. "Sir," he said in a cold, almost practiced tone, "you're trespassing." Jake froze, the words hanging in the air like smoke. Trespassing? This was his property. His house. His land. His name was carved on the deed. He had built the fence himself, planted the trees in the yard, painted the porch with his own hands. The idea of trespassing here was ridiculous, yet the way they stood, the way they watched him, made it clear they were serious. The neighborhood was quiet, but not truly silent. Behind the curtains, faces were peeking out. The neighbors were watching. No one was stepping forward. No one was saying a word. It felt like the entire street was holding its breath. Jake straightened his shoulders slowly. "I live here," he said in a steady voice. "This is my home." The officer with the clipboard didn't blink. He just tightened his jaw and said again, this time even colder, "Not anymore, sir." A second officer, a younger man with a shaved head and a badge on his arm, shifted his stance like he was ready for a fight. The third officer raised a phone slightly, as if recording everything. They weren't here to talk. They were here to intimidate. Jake could see it in their posture, in the way they blocked the path to his porch. The air grew heavier. Somewhere a dog barked in the distance, but it only made the silence feel sharper. Jake's hands curled slightly at his sides. He had seen this kind of tactic before, not here, not with an HOA, but in far more dangerous places. When people wanted to break your will, they came in groups. They cornered you. They made you feel small. He had faced worse than this. He was not the man to bow down. Still, he stayed calm. He had learned long ago that silence was more powerful than shouting. The lead officer took another step forward, his boots landing on the edge of Jake's lawn. "We've given notice. You ignored it. You're in violation of HOA property boundaries. This land falls under the community zone now. You need to vacate immediately." His words were rehearsed, too smooth, like a line repeated 100 times. Jake narrowed his eyes. He had never received any notice. He had checked his mailbox before leaving. He had no unpaid fines. No letters. No warnings. This wasn't an accident. This was a setup. He let his eyes move slowly across the street. A few neighbors were standing behind their fences, whispering to each other. Someone held up a phone, recording the scene. Nobody wanted to get involved. Jake's yard, once the quiet corner of the neighborhood, had turned into a silent stage. The officers seemed to like the attention. The lead one smirked faintly, enjoying the power. The younger one tapped the ground with his boot. Jake could see it in their body language. They thought they had him. Jake inhaled slowly, letting the cold evening air fill his lungs. They didn't know who they were dealing with. To them, he was just another homeowner. Another easy target to pressure and control. What they didn't know, what no one in this neighborhood truly knew, was what he used to do before moving here. He wasn't just a quiet man with a nice house and a truck. His badge, the one locked in a drawer inside, carried more weight than their entire HOA board combined. But right now, he didn't need to flash it. He just needed to watch. The lead officer's smirk widened. "We can do this the easy way or the hard way," he said. "Your truck, your tools, your property, everything here, belongs to the HOA now. You signed the community rules. You know the law." Jake tilted his head slightly. He knew every inch of his deed, every line of his rights. What this man was saying wasn't just wrong. It was illegal. But they were too confident, too sure of their plan. This wasn't about law. This was about intimidation. A cold wind blew down the street, rustling the branches of the trees above. The shadows stretched across the yard, long and dark. The younger officer cracked his knuckles. The one holding the phone whispered something under his breath, probably a comment about Jake's reaction. But Jake didn't flinch. He stood like a wall, quiet and steady. He could almost hear the quick breaths of the men in front of him. They were trying to look powerful, but their fear was hiding in their eyes. "You should leave now," the lead officer said again, his voice lower but sharper, like a knife pressing against skin. Jake's silence was making him nervous. People like him were used to making others panic. Jake wasn't panicking. He was calculating. Every movement, every word, every second counted. In the far corner of his yard, the old oak tree creaked softly in the wind. A few porch lights flicked on down the street. Jake finally moved, just a small step forward. It was enough to make the younger officer tense up and adjust his stance. Jake kept his voice low and even. "You're on my property," he said, "and you don't have the authority to tell me otherwise." The lead officer's smile faltered for the first time. The recording phone shifted slightly. Something in Jake's eyes told them this wasn't going to be as easy as they thought. The neighbors leaned closer to their windows, sensing the tension climbing like heat before a storm. Jake didn't shout. He didn't wave his hands. He simply looked at each one of them with a calm that came from years of standing in much darker places than this suburban street. Inside the house, his badge waited, a reminder of who he really was. He hadn't planned to use it. He had moved here for quiet, not confrontation. But sometimes, quiet men carried the loudest power. The officers didn't know it yet, but they were standing on the wrong lawn, picking a fight they couldn't win. And for the first time that night, Jake felt the shift, small, quiet, but real. This wasn't fear anymore. This was a storm waiting to break. The lead officer's fake smile faded as Jake stood firm, and for the first time that night, the tension in the air grew heavier, like a rope pulled tight and ready to snap. The clipboard officer stepped closer, tapping the corner of the paper with his pen like he was the law itself. "You've been given warnings," he said slowly, his voice carrying a tone of control. "And this is your last chance to cooperate." Jake didn't move. He could see the way the man's hand tightened around the pen, how the other two shifted their feet to box him in. This wasn't about a misunderstanding. This was a power play. HOA officers like these didn't just show up at night without a plan. They came when they thought their target was weak. They thought tonight would be easy. They were wrong. Jake tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing. "Warnings?" he repeated calmly. "I didn't get a single one." The younger officer with the shaved head smirked and pulled a folded envelope from his back pocket like it was proof of some great crime. He waved it slowly in front of Jake like bait. "Certified letter," he said. "Refused." Jake raised an eyebrow. That was a lie. He had signed for every delivery since the day he bought this house. The letter wasn't refused. It was forged, or delivered to the wrong address on purpose. He could see it in the man's eyes. They weren't here to argue facts. They were here to corner him. The phone held by the third officer moved closer now, the little red light on the corner flashing, recording everything. They wanted to capture the moment they made him look weak. They wanted proof to twist the story. But Jake wasn't the kind of man who broke under pressure. He stepped closer to his porch, not retreating but standing taller, letting the yellow light from the front door spill across his face. "This is my property," he said again, slower this time, every word heavy like stone. The lead officer took a deep breath as if trying to stay in control, but Jake saw the crack. He saw the way his fingers twitched. Bullies always twitched when things didn't go their way. "Not anymore," the clipboard man said, waving his pen toward the fence line. "This land has been annexed. The HOA owns the lot now. We gave you 48 hours. You're out of time." Jake glanced at the fence. Someone had replaced the marker flags that marked the boundary. The property line had been moved inward, about 10 feet, enough to make it look like his front yard belonged to the HOA. It was planned carefully. Not something done overnight. Not something done by accident. This was a trap built piece by piece while he was away. The younger officer stepped closer, too close, invading his space. "Look," he said, pretending to sound reasonable. "You seem like a smart guy. Just leave tonight. It'll be easier for you. We can make this smooth or we can make this messy." His words were coated in fake kindness, but the threat behind them was sharp. Jake kept his hands loose by his sides, though every muscle in his body was ready. He had heard that kind of voice before, overseas, in rooms where men tried to scare him. It didn't work then, and it wouldn't work now. Neighbors were whispering louder now. Curtains moved like nervous eyes. A few phones were recording from across the street. The HOA wanted an audience. They wanted to make an example of him. If Jake backed down, they'd do the same thing to the next neighbor and the one after that. But if he stood his ground, they'd have a problem they couldn't control. He met the eyes of the young officer and said in a calm, deep voice, "I'm not leaving my house." The smirk vanished from the young man's face. The lead officer sighed dramatically and pulled out a folded stack of papers from the clipboard. He held them up high like a court order, though Jake knew it wasn't. HOA officers loved fake authority. They counted on fear to make people believe their word was law. "This is an official notice," the man declared loudly, making sure the neighbors could hear. "You are in violation of Community Bylaws 14B and 22C. This structure," he pointed to Jake's house, "will be seized if you do not comply." Jake almost laughed. They were putting on a show, not realizing the man they were trying to scare didn't scare easily. He took one slow step forward. The officers tensed. He could feel their uncertainty. The young one's jaw clenched. The man with the phone took half a step back, even if he tried to act tough. Jake's voice was low, calm, and steady when he spoke. "You've made a big mistake coming here like this." The lead officer's expression hardened. "Big mistake? The only mistake is yours," he said. "You signed the agreement when you moved in. You gave us the right to manage this property." Jake raised an eyebrow. He never signed anything that gave them control of his house. He knew every word on that paper, and their claim was a lie. But they didn't know what kind of man they were talking to. They didn't know the training. They didn't know what that badge inside the house meant. The young officer tried to move closer again, this time trying to push Jake back with his presence. But Jake didn't move. Not even an inch. His calmness made them uneasy. This was supposed to be quick. They were supposed to make him scared, get their footage, and walk away like heroes. Instead, they were standing in front of a wall they couldn't shake. The neighbors could feel it too. The tension was turning into something sharper, like lightning building in the sky before a storm. The lead officer raised his voice now. "If you don't comply, we'll remove you by force," he said. His tone was shaking, just a little, but enough for Jake to hear it. The man with the phone nodded, trying to back him up. The younger one's hands curled into fists. They wanted to push him into making a mistake. But Jake had been in rooms far more dangerous than this. He had stood in front of people with far more power than 3 wannabe officers with clipboards. "You think this is your land," the older man hissed, "but it's not. You'll learn that soon." Jake's lips curved into a faint, dangerous smile. "No," he said softly, "you'll learn." The officer blinked. The neighbors whispered louder. A few porch lights flicked on around the street. Even the man holding the phone lowered it slightly. Something about the way Jake said those words made the air shift. It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. A quiet storm. A warning. Inside the house, just a few steps away, sat the leather wallet with his FBI badge. It had been months since he'd needed to show it. But tonight might be different. He didn't want to use it. Not yet. Let them keep digging their own hole. Let them keep pushing. Because when the truth came out, they wouldn't be standing there with fake papers and smug smiles. They'd be running. The lead officer finally spoke again, forcing his voice to sound strong. "We'll be back," he said, tapping the papers against his clipboard. "Tomorrow morning, you won't be here. That's a promise." Jake didn't even blink. He watched them turn, walk down his driveway, and disappear into the night with their flashlights cutting across the street. But as they left, he could still feel the tension they had tried to bring into his home. And what they didn't realize was that they had just picked a fight with the wrong man. The night felt longer than usual after the HOA officers walked away, their flashlights cutting through the dark like thin blades, but Jake didn't go inside right away. He stood on the porch in silence, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the edge of the street where they had been standing minutes ago. The smell of damp soil mixed with the cool night air, and the sound of distant crickets filled the empty spaces they left behind. But the silence didn't calm him, it sharpened him. He had seen this kind of tactic before. People like them always came with fake confidence, thinking fear would do their work for them. But Jake wasn't like the others in this neighborhood. They didn't know who they were playing with. He slowly walked down the steps, his boots pressing against the gravel, and headed toward the fence line. When he reached it, his eyes narrowed. There they were. Fresh boundary markers, bright red flags sticking out of the ground, cutting through his yard like a knife. Someone had moved the line. They had actually come onto his property and pushed the boundaries back, taking 10 feet of his front yard. 10 feet might not sound like much to most people, but to someone like Jake, it was everything. It was proof. He crouched down, touched the soil near the new stake, and felt how loose it was. This had been done in the last 48 hours, maybe less. His boots scuffed at the ground, uncovering the faint drag marks of a metal tape reel. They had measured everything, moved the flags, and made it look like the HOA owned that strip of land. This wasn't sloppy work. It was calculated. He straightened slowly and looked across the street. A few porch lights were still on. Curtains twitched as if someone was still watching. Some neighbors knew what was happening but didn't have the courage to say a word. They had seen how the HOA worked in the past. Quiet threats, fake notices, board meetings where decisions were made behind closed doors. Jake had ignored them because they never bothered him. But tonight, they crossed the line, literally. He turned around, his boots crunching against the gravel, and went back up the porch steps, his mind already moving like a machine. He wasn't just going to defend his home. He was going to dismantle their entire plan. Inside the house, the warm light from the kitchen spilled across the floor. He didn't turn on any more lights. Instead, he walked to the small cabinet near the wall, opened the drawer slowly, and pulled out a thick brown envelope. Inside was his property deed, maps, original blueprints, and every legal document tied to this house. He had kept everything in order. He always did. He spread the papers out on the kitchen counter like pieces on a chessboard. Every line on those documents was clear, every measurement exact. That 10 feet of land they were trying to claim wasn't just his yard. It was legally protected federal property tied to his ownership. No HOA in the world could take that. He leaned over the documents, tracing the property line with his finger. His memory was sharp. He didn't need the papers to know the truth. But seeing it in black and white only made his anger colder, harder, sharper. This wasn't about some misunderstanding. This was a land grab. They wanted his property, and they thought intimidation would be enough. They didn't realize they picked the wrong house. Jake pulled out his phone from his pocket and opened his security camera app. The front yard feed lit up the screen. He scrolled back through the recordings, eyes locked on the timeline. And then he saw it. 2 nights ago, 3 men wearing HOA jackets walking onto his lawn around midnight. They were carrying metal stakes, reels of measuring tape, and something else in their hands, blueprints. They moved quickly, like men who'd done this before. One of them spray-painted a line on the ground. Another hammered the stakes. The third placed a warning sign that Jake hadn't even noticed earlier because they'd hidden it behind the bushes. His jaw tightened. They had done everything in the dark, away from the neighbors, away from questions. But they didn't know his cameras saw everything. He rewound the footage, zoomed in on their faces. He recognized them. The same 3 who stood at his fence earlier. One of them even laughed while pulling the tape. They were too confident, too sure they'd get away with it. Jake saved the footage and backed it up on 2 different drives. Then he opened another tab and pulled up the legal HOA charter for the neighborhood. It took him seconds to find the clauses they were pretending to use. Bylaws 14b and 22c. He read them carefully. And just like he expected, none of it gave them the right to touch his land. They had twisted the words, counting on the fact that most homeowners never read the fine print. But Jake wasn't most homeowners. He leaned against the counter, breathing steady, letting the cold anger settle like ice in his chest. He had dealt with people far more dangerous than a few corrupt board members. These weren't trained soldiers, they were opportunists. And opportunists only had power until someone pushed back harder. He walked over to the cabinet again and opened the small black case on the top shelf. Inside, wrapped in soft leather, was his badge. He hadn't worn it in a long time. The gold emblem caught the dim light and shone faintly. He ran his thumb across the edge, a familiar weight pressing into his palm. They thought he was just a man living in a quiet house, someone they could bully with fake papers and loud voices. But if they pushed one step further, they'd find out exactly who he was. He slipped the badge back into the case, not ready to show it yet. Not yet. The right moment would come, and when it did, their faces would change in an instant. Instead, he turned back to the table, stacked the deed, the footage, and printed screenshots of their midnight trespassing. Every piece of their plan was already falling apart, and they didn't even know it. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, making the boundary flags tremble like they were shivering. Jake stepped out once more, standing in the dark, staring at those red flags. He could almost hear their arrogance in the way they planted them, like they owned the street. But soon, those flags wouldn't be theirs. He would make sure of it. The HOA thought they were starting a simple property dispute, but they had just stepped into something much bigger. They had declared a quiet war. And Jake didn't lose wars. The next morning came quietly, but Jake could feel the tension in the air the moment he opened his front door. The sun had barely risen, and a thin layer of mist covered the neighborhood street like a pale curtain. Birds chirped softly, unaware of the storm waiting to unfold. Jake's boots crunched against the damp wood of the porch as he stepped outside. His eyes went straight to the red boundary flags hammered into his yard, their bright color screaming like a challenge. He could already see 2 HOA trucks parked at the end of the street, their engines running, exhaust rolling out into the cool air. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. He walked down the steps, calm but focused, his jaw set like stone. His mind wasn't clouded with panic. It was sharp, steady, ready. He had spent half the night printing documents, reviewing every law, and replaying the security footage of them trespassing on his land. He knew exactly what they did, when they did it, and how they tried to twist the rules. Now, it was time to make them see what kind of mistake they had made. As he crossed his yard, he noticed more movement. A group of neighbors had gathered near their driveways, pretending to sweep or check their mailboxes but clearly waiting for something to happen. Some of them whispered nervously, their eyes flicking between Jake's house and the parked HOA trucks. They had seen how the board operated before, harassing homeowners, sending fake notices, pushing their way into properties that didn't belong to them. No one had ever fought back. But Jake wasn't anyone. Then they came. 3 officers again, the same faces from last night. The lead officer with the clipboard wore a smug expression, as if he had already won. The younger one with the shaved head chewed gum slowly, shoulders puffed up like he was some kind of enforcer. The one with the phone walked a few steps behind them, already hitting the record button as they stepped onto the street. Jake didn't move. He just watched them approach, his hands relaxed at his sides, his face unreadable. The lead officer spoke first. "Good morning, Mr. Reynolds," he said in a voice too smooth to be genuine. "We gave you the night to think it over. I trust you'll make the smart choice today." Jake didn't answer. He let the man talk, and the silence made him uneasy. The officer's smile twitched for half a second before he continued, waving the clipboard. "We've got the papers. The board has approved the annexation. Your fence is now HOA property. You need to remove your belongings from this area before our contractors arrive." Jake's eyes moved to the end of the street. A white utility van had just pulled in, men inside wearing reflective vests and carrying equipment. They were going to tear down his fence today. He almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because of how far they were willing to go with their bluff. They were so confident that he'd fold like everyone else. The younger officer spat his gum onto the road. "You can leave now, or we'll have to escort you off your property," he said, trying to sound tough. The man with the phone zoomed in closer, probably hoping to capture a heated argument to make Jake look like the bad guy. But Jake wasn't going to give them that. He slowly took a step forward, the crunch of gravel under his boots louder than their fake authority. "This isn't your property," Jake said in a steady, cold voice. "And you're not removing anything." The lead officer let out a short laugh. "That's where you're wrong," he said. "We have full authority under Community Bylaws 14B and 22C. You signed the documents when you moved here." Jake tilted his head slightly, his eyes locked on the man's face. "No," he said quietly, "I read the documents. And you're lying." For a brief moment, the officer's confidence cracked, just slightly. He covered it with a smirk and gestured to the contractors. "Let's not waste time. Boys, get to work." The men in reflective vests started unloading tools from the van. One of them picked up a crowbar. Another carried a metal cutter. The sound of the van door slamming echoed through the street, pulling more neighbors out of their homes. Everyone was watching now, holding their breath, waiting to see what Jake would do. Jake walked slowly toward the boundary line, placing himself directly in front of the first red flag. His shadow stretched long across the ground. The contractors hesitated. They weren't HOA board members. They were just workers. But even they could feel something in the way Jake stood there, something that told them this wasn't like the other times. The younger officer barked, "Move aside," but Jake didn't move an inch. The lead officer stepped closer, his voice dripping with mock patience. "Look, Mr. Reynolds, this doesn't have to get ugly. We're trying to keep this civil. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Jake leaned forward just slightly, enough for the man to feel the pressure. His voice was low and controlled when he spoke. "You've already made it hard. You stepped on my land in the middle of the night. You moved the boundary flags. You forged your authority. And now you're trying to steal property that doesn't belong to you." The neighbors murmured quietly, their whispers spreading like a wave. Some of them pulled out their phones, recording from their porches. The younger officer shifted uncomfortably now. The man with the phone lowered it slightly. The contractors exchanged uneasy glances. Jake's calmness wasn't something they expected. They were used to yelling, crying, begging, people who didn't know how to fight back. But Jake wasn't scared. The lead officer forced a smile again, trying to keep control of the situation. "You can take this to court if you want," he said, though his voice wavered. "But today, this fence is coming down." Jake reached into his jacket slowly, deliberately, and pulled out the folded legal deed. He opened it in front of the man, pointing to the exact line that proved the land was his and not part of the HOA jurisdiction. "You're standing on federal recorded property," Jake said. "Every inch of this land is protected under Title 32. You step 1 foot past this line with that crowbar, and you won't just have a complaint on your hands. You'll have federal charges." The lead officer blinked. That wasn't the reaction he expected. "Title what?" he said, his voice slipping just a little. Jake didn't answer. He just stared at him, calm, steady, unshaken. The man with the phone lowered his hand all the way now. The younger officer looked confused, glancing between Jake and his boss. The contractors froze in place. Nobody wanted to be the first to move. The wind blew lightly, rustling the red flags between them. Jake didn't even have to raise his voice. His presence alone was enough to make them hesitate. He had seen this pattern before, in interrogation rooms, in operations, in situations where one calm man could turn fear against the people trying to control him. The lead officer finally forced out, "We'll be back with legal," trying to save face. But even as he said it, his voice wasn't as confident as before. Jake didn't reply. He just gave him a look, a quiet, cold stare that made the man's throat tighten. And for the first time, the officers took a step back. They came expecting to win. But what they didn't understand yet was that Jake was only getting started. They thought they were dealing with a regular homeowner. Soon, they would find out they had just walked into a storm they couldn't control. The sun climbed higher into the sky, burning away the morning mist, but the heat settling over the street wasn't from the weather alone. Tension clung to the air like smoke after a fire. The HOA trucks idled at the end of the street, their engines rumbling like they were refusing to admit defeat. The officers had backed off, but only for now. Jake knew their kind. They didn't give up when they lost ground. They came back harder, louder, and dirtier. And sure enough, less than an hour later, another car rolled into the neighborhood. A sleek black SUV with tinted windows. This wasn't a contractor. This was someone higher up. The HOA president had arrived. She stepped out of the car with the kind of fake confidence that people wore when they were used to bullying others. A woman in her 50s, wearing a pearl necklace and a wide, rehearsed smile that didn't reach her cold eyes. She adjusted the collar of her blazer like she was walking into a courtroom she already owned. 2 more board members followed behind her, whispering to each other and glancing nervously at Jake's house. She didn't look nervous at all. She looked like someone who thought the entire street belonged to her. Jake was sitting on the porch steps when she approached, calm, steady, watching her like a wolf sizing up prey that thought it was a hunter. She didn't even wait to get close before she started talking, her voice sharp and commanding. "Mr. Reynolds," she said, "we're not here to argue. We're here to enforce community law. You've been in violation for months, and this ends today." Jake didn't stand. He didn't need to. "Violation?" he said quietly, his voice smooth like steel wrapped in silk. "You moved my property line in the middle of the night. That's not a violation on my end." Her smile didn't falter, but her eyes narrowed. "Our records show this land was annexed into HOA authority years ago. You bought the house under that agreement. You're required to comply like everyone else." Jake tilted his head slightly, studying her. She was used to people arguing, begging, or folding under pressure. But she didn't know him. He stood slowly, towering slightly over her, and stepped down onto the driveway. His boots hit the ground with a solid, steady thud. The board members flinched without meaning to. "Show me those records," he said. She pulled a thick folder from her bag and waved it in front of him like a trophy. "I don't have to show you anything," she said. "We've already filed the paperwork. We have authority to take control of this land. You can't stop it." Jake's expression didn't change. "File it wherever you want," he said calmly. "But unless that folder holds a federal court order, this is still my land. And you're trespassing." That word, trespassing, hit her like a slap she wasn't expecting. Her smile stiffened. The board members shifted uncomfortably. She raised her chin higher, as if trying to look down at him. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be, Mr. Reynolds," she said. "We have contractors ready, trucks ready, and authority behind us. I strongly suggest you pack your things and vacate this section before we're forced to call the police." Jake's eyes narrowed just slightly. "Call them," he said. That simple response landed heavier than any threat. Her eyes flickered. People like her were used to people backing away at that point. No one had ever told her to go ahead and call the cops before. She recovered quickly and gestured to one of the board members, who fumbled with his phone, whispering into it like he was reporting a hostage situation. Across the street, neighbors whispered louder, filming from porches. A few more cars stopped at the end of the block, people curious about the unfolding drama. The HOA had planned a show of power. They wanted to humiliate him in front of everyone. But they didn't know the man they had picked. 10 minutes later, 2 local police cruisers rolled into the street. Lights flashing, but no sirens. The HOA president straightened her blazer like a queen welcoming her army. The officers stepped out, their hands resting on their belts, looking around, clearly unsure of what kind of situation they were walking into. She rushed to them first, painting the picture before Jake could speak. Her voice carried, sharp and fake sweet. "Officers, thank you for coming. This homeowner is refusing to vacate property owned by the HOA. He's violating bylaws and obstructing lawful enforcement. We need him removed from the premises immediately." Jake didn't interrupt. He didn't rush to defend himself. He waited. He had dealt with law enforcement before, on the other side of the badge. When the officers turned to him, he didn't flinch. He simply held out the thick, official deed, along with the printed footage from last night. "This is my land," he said in a low, even tone. "They moved my property markers in the dark, forged a notice, and entered illegally. They're trespassing, not me." The younger of the two officers took the documents, his brow furrowing as he read. The older one stepped toward the flags and looked down at the ground carefully. "When were these put in?" he asked. Jake didn't hesitate. 48 hours ago. "I have them on camera," he said, pulling out his phone and opening the footage. The moment the officers saw the 3 HOA men sneaking around in the night, hammering stakes into the ground, their expressions shifted. The older cop's jaw tightened. The HOA president's fake confidence cracked for the first time. "This isn't what it looks like," she said quickly, stepping forward. "That was just routine. Routine trespassing." Jake cut in, his voice still calm but laced with iron. The officers exchanged glances. The older one straightened up, turning to the HOA president. From what I'm seeing here, this doesn't look like a civil matter anymore. This looks like tampering with property lines and unlawful entry." She stiffened. "You don't understand, officer. We have the authority." He held up a hand. "Authority doesn't give you the right to move federal property lines in the middle of the night," he said sharply. The neighbors' whispers grew louder now. Phones tilted up, catching everything. The board members behind her looked pale. This wasn't going the way they had planned. She tried to step closer to Jake, her voice trembling slightly now. "Mr. Reynolds, if we just sit down and talk." Jake took one deliberate step forward, meeting her eyes with the calm of someone who had stared down much worse. "No," he said softly. "You tried to take what's mine. You threatened me on my own land. You lied. Now it's over." The older officer stepped between them. He said firmly. "I suggest you and your board step back before this turns into something much bigger than a property dispute." For the first time, she didn't have a comeback. She blinked, mouth opening but no words coming out. The younger officer, who had been chewing gum earlier, shifted uncomfortably behind her. The men with the trucks started backing their vehicles out slowly, realizing this wasn't their fight. Jake stood there, calm and unmoving, the sun shining behind him, casting a long shadow across the stolen boundary line. They came here to break him in front of the whole neighborhood. Instead, they were the ones retreating. What they didn't realize was that this was only the first reveal. They still didn't know what he truly carried inside that house. They still didn't know who he was. But soon, they would. And when they did, everything they thought they controlled would collapse in seconds. The street grew quieter after the police left, but it wasn't the calm of peace. It was the kind of silence that comes before something bigger hits. The HOA president had walked away with her fake smile gone, her shoulders stiff, and her board members trailing behind like a broken parade. But Jake knew she wasn't done. People like her didn't stop after one loss. They came back harder, more desperate, and more dangerous. And that was exactly why he didn't relax. He went inside his house, locked the door behind him, and walked straight to the drawer where he kept the badge. 4 years, he had chosen a quiet life, one far away from the noise of operations, power games, and intimidation. But now the HOA had kicked the hornet's nest, and they had no idea what they'd awakened. He pulled out the leather case slowly, the familiar weight of the gold emblem resting in his hand. The badge of the Federal Bureau of Investigation wasn't something you waved around lightly. It was something that carried the weight of the law, something that turned fake power into dust. He ran his thumb over the edges, feeling the cold metal under his skin. He didn't want to use it, but after what happened this morning, it wasn't just about his property anymore. It was about drawing a line they could never cross again. He opened his laptop and logged into the secure portal he hadn't touched in months. Old habits came back like muscle memory. He typed fast, accessing official land records, running a search through federal databases. Within minutes, every single forged document the HOA had submitted was exposed. They had taken an outdated map, twisted it, and tried to claim land that wasn't even under their legal reach. This wasn't just harassment. It was fraud. And he wasn't going to let it slide. He downloaded the evidence, printed copies, and slipped them into a black folder. Then, almost as an afterthought, he clipped his badge onto his belt, not to show off, but to remind himself exactly who he was. Outside, his cameras picked up movement. 2 HOA board members were standing near the property line again, pointing and whispering nervously. They weren't alone this time. Another unfamiliar car had parked a little further down. Jake recognized the type. It was the HOA lawyer. This wasn't just intimidation anymore. This was their attempt to clean up their mess before it turned into something bigger. Jake stepped outside slowly, letting the door creak open, his presence alone enough to make the 2 board members step back a little. The lawyer, a slick man in a gray suit, adjusted his tie and forced a smile that didn't fool anyone. "Mr. Reynolds," he said, his voice smooth, too polished. "I think we should discuss this situation calmly. No need to escalate. We're all civilized here." Jake walked down the steps without a word. The air grew heavier with every step. "Escalate?" he said quietly, his voice calm but carrying weight. "You trespassed, forged documents, and tried to steal land. You already escalated." The lawyer's smile twitched, but he kept talking. "There may have been misunderstandings. Our client, the HOA board, believes there's a legal claim to this land. We can resolve this without involving outside forces. If you're willing to compromise." Jake cut him off. "No." The word wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. It rolled out like iron, steady and final. The lawyer tried again, but Jake was already stepping closer to the red flags, the same ones they had hammered into his ground like they owned the world. He pointed at them slowly. "You'll remove these," he said, his tone dropping lower, sharper. "You'll file a retraction with the county office, and you'll keep your people off my property. If not, this won't be a conversation anymore. It'll be a federal investigation." The lawyer's smile cracked completely now. "You can't threaten." Jake reached down slowly and lifted the edge of his shirt just enough for the gold badge to catch the light. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. But it was enough. The lawyer froze mid-sentence, his breath catching as his eyes widened. The 2 board members behind him stumbled a step back, their whispers dying on their tongues. The moment stretched long and silent, like the air itself held its breath. "I'm not threatening," Jake said softly. "I'm giving you facts. You trespassed on federal property. You falsified legal records. You intimidated a homeowner. And now you're standing here, lying to my face. I suggest you think very carefully about your next words." The lawyer's throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. "Federal," he stammered. "This is a local matter." "Not anymore," Jake replied, his eyes locking on him. "You made it federal the moment you stepped over that line." The lawyer looked like he wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. The board members turned pale, whispering nervously to each other. One of them tried to inch backward, but Jake's voice stopped them cold. "You'll fix this. Every single thing you changed. Every stake, every map, every word. And if you don't, the next people standing here won't be your lawyer and your friends. It'll be federal agents. And trust me," he added, his voice dropping even lower, "they won't be as patient as I am." The lawyer's hands twitched at his sides. He nodded stiffly. "We'll review the documents," he muttered, stepping back toward his car. Jake didn't move. He just stood there, watching them retreat, one step at a time. The 2 board members followed like frightened children caught doing something they couldn't explain. The neighbors across the street whispered louder now, their phones raised again, capturing everything. This wasn't a quiet fight anymore. This was a turning point. Everyone had just seen what the HOA was really dealing with. When the SUV finally rolled away, Jake stood at the boundary line, his boots planted in the dirt they tried to steal. The sun hit his badge just enough to make it shine faintly. He hadn't even needed to raise his voice or call anyone. Just the sight of the truth was enough to make them tremble. But he knew this wasn't over yet. People like the HOA president didn't give up easily. She'd come back. She'd try again. But now the board knew what they were up against. Not a scared homeowner. Not an easy target. But a man who could crush their little kingdom without lifting a finger. Jake took one last look at the red flags before yanking the first one out of the ground and tossing it aside. One by one, he pulled every stake they had planted, throwing them into a pile like garbage. Then he turned, walked back to his porch, and closed the door behind him with quiet finality. The game had changed, and now they were the ones on defense. The next evening came fast, but the neighborhood didn't feel the same anymore. What had once been a quiet suburban street now carried a strange kind of energy. Whispers that floated through open windows, faces that peeked from curtains, and cautious steps from people who used to ignore each other. Everyone had seen what happened. Everyone had watched the mighty HOA officers walk away with their tails between their legs, their lawyer stumbling over his words, and their fake authority shattered by one man who didn't flinch. Jake had become the name on every porch and the story in every hushed conversation. But Jake didn't care about the whispers. He cared about the message. And that message was clear. No one steals from him. He stood on his porch with a cup of black coffee in hand, the night air cool against his face. The red flags they'd planted in his yard were gone, ripped out by his own hands and dumped in a trash bag like the lies they represented. But Jake knew their kind. The HOA wasn't finished. People who built their power on fear didn't disappear after losing once. They regrouped, they plotted, and they came back. That was why tonight, Jake was ready. His phone buzzed softly on the railing. A text came in from one of the neighbors, a quiet older man who never got involved in anything before. They're meeting at the clubhouse. Talking about you. Jake didn't even need the details. Of course they were. The HOA president couldn't stand what happened in front of everyone. She'd want to fix her image, tighten her control, prove that she was still the queen of this street. But what she didn't realize was that she wasn't holding the board anymore. Fear was cracking. Jake had lit a fire in this neighborhood without saying a single speech. He finished his coffee, set the mug down, and walked to his truck. The headlights cut through the night as he drove the short distance to the HOA clubhouse, a white-painted building with a proud little sign out front, the kind that pretended to be official. Several cars were already parked outside. Their shadows stretched long under the parking lot lights. As he pulled in, heads turned. A few board members were standing near the entrance. The lawyer was there too, looking pale and uneasy, like a man forced to return to a place he didn't want to be. And at the center of it all, the HOA president stood like a statue, clutching a folder to her chest as if it could shield her from the storm. Jake stepped out slowly, not in a rush, his boots hitting the asphalt with that same calm rhythm. The group stiffened. Their whispers died. He didn't have to speak for the air to grow heavier. He pushed the door open and walked straight inside. The room smelled of polished wood and cheap coffee. The entire board was seated at a long table, papers spread out like they were preparing for war. But Jake wasn't intimidated. He had walked into real war zones before. This was a meeting room full of cowards with pens. The president straightened in her chair, putting on that fake authority again. "Mr. Reynolds," she said, her voice sharp but trembling underneath. "This is a private meeting. You can't just walk in here uninvited." Jake didn't even blink. "You stepped on my land uninvited," he said quietly, and that single line silenced the room. A few board members exchanged nervous looks. One of them muttered something under his breath, but no one dared speak louder. The president forced herself to sit taller, trying to salvage control. "We're here to discuss the future of this community," she said. "You're causing division. People are scared. You're creating conflict where there was none." Jake tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing just enough to make her voice shake. "I didn't create the conflict," he said slowly. "You did when you tried to steal what doesn't belong to you." The lawyer cleared his throat awkwardly, shuffling the papers in front of him. "Mr. Reynolds," he began carefully, "perhaps we can resolve this through compromise. No need to involve any." Jake reached into his jacket and laid the black folder on the table with a quiet thud. "No more games," he said. These are copies of the property deed, the security footage, and the federal complaint I've already filed. Every single illegal action you took, every flag, every forged notice, every trespass, is documented and backed by law. You thought this was a game. It's not. The lawyer's mouth went dry. The president's face turned pale. She tried to keep her voice steady but failed. You're bluffing, she whispered. Jake slowly pulled the badge from his belt and placed it beside the folder. The gold emblem gleamed under the fluorescent lights. A heavy silence fell over the room. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The lawyer's pen slipped from his fingers and clattered on the floor. The president's eyes widened, her throat tightening as she stared at the badge. I don't bluff, Jake said softly, his voice calm but carrying a weight that crushed their fake authority. You trespassed on federal property. You committed fraud. You intimidated a federal officer on his own land. Do you understand how big of a mistake that is? One of the board members spoke up weakly. We didn't know. Jake turned his head slightly, locking eyes with him. You should have thought about that before you followed her. The president finally broke her silence, but her voice wasn't sharp anymore. It was shaky. What do you want? She asked, every bit of arrogance gone. Jake leaned forward just slightly. I want my property line restored. I want every false claim withdrawn. And I want it in writing. Tonight. The lawyer didn't even argue. He grabbed the folder in front of him and started scribbling notes. One by one, the board members nodded, their courage draining out of them. The president looked like she wanted to fight back, but every time she looked at the badge, her words died in her throat. For the first time, she realized she had picked a battle she couldn't win. When Jake finally walked out of that room, the night air felt cooler, cleaner. He didn't need to shout or make threats. He didn't need to fight them the way they tried to fight him. All it took was the truth, and the quiet power they never saw coming. As he stepped off the porch of the clubhouse, a few neighbors who had been watching from the sidewalk began to clap softly. Not loud. Not theatrical. Just a quiet ripple of respect. The fear that had chained this street for years was starting to crack. People had seen the HOA bully others for too long. But tonight, they saw someone stand tall. Someone who didn't bend. Jake didn't smile. He just walked back to his truck, climbed in, and started the engine. The headlights cut through the darkness as he drove home. The red flags were gone, the board was broken, and the street finally felt like it belonged to the people again, not the HOA. This wasn't just a win. This was a warning that would echo long after tonight. No one would ever step on his land again. And if they tried, they'd remember the night the HOA met the wrong man.